There are some nights that linger in your mind, nights where the silence is thick, almost like the world is holding its breath. It was one of those nights. The air was crisp, the streets empty, and I was just making my way home from another long, draining day at work. I remember it clearly, the city lights casting a dull glow across the pavement, the faint smell of rain from earlier in the day, and the quiet crunch of gravel under my shoes. I've always found the night peaceful, in a way. It's like the world sheds its chaos and settles into a kind of stillness, a calm that lets you think. But that night, there was something different. It was a subtle thing, like the way a shadow shifts when you're not looking. It was almost like the silence itself was watching me, waiting for me to notice something, waiting for me to see. As I turned onto 6th Street, I noticed someone standing under the glow of a streetlight about a block away. At first, it didn't seem strange. People loiter around all the time, especially on quiet streets like this. But as I drew closer, I felt this pressure. It's hard to explain, but it was like the air around him was heavier, thick with something I couldn't quite place. I stopped, my footsteps echoing slightly in the silence, my gaze locked on the figure. He was just standing there, not moving, his arms at his sides, head tilted slightly forward. There was nothing particularly striking about him. In fact, if I were to describe him to someone, I don't think I'd even remember his face. He was just average. But something was wrong. There was this feeling, this creeping unease that started at the base of my spine and spread like an icy hand gripping my nerves. I stood there, trying to make sense of it, when I realized what was bothering me. The light was shining directly down on him, casting everything around him in a soft yellow glow. But beneath his feet, there was nothing, no shadow, just an empty, dark spot where his shadow should have been. It was as if he'd been cut out of reality, a hollow figure standing alone in the light. My heart began to pound, a slow, deliberate rhythm that seemed to echo in my ears. I thought about turning around, but something kept me rooted to the spot. I watched him, my eyes tracing the edges of his form, trying to find any sign that I was just seeing things. Maybe it was a trick of the light, maybe, but no matter how hard I looked, his shadow was missing. It was just gone. And then, he moved. It was subtle, just a small tilt of his head, but it felt like a gunshot in the silence. His gaze shifted, locking onto me, and I felt a wave of nausea hit me. His eyes were empty, hollow, like two dark voids that seemed to pull me in, drawing me closer even as every instinct in my body screamed at me to run. I couldn't move, couldn't look away. It was like he was holding me there, trapping me in that gaze. For what felt like an eternity, we just stared at each other, his expression unreadable, his form still as stone. And then slowly, he tilted his head just a bit more, a slight, almost imperceptible movement that felt wrong. There was something unnatural about it, something that made my skin crawl. It was as if he was studying me, sizing me up, like a predator watching its prey. I finally forced myself to take a step back, my heart racing, my body tense, and as I did, I saw it, just a flicker, out of the corner of my eye. His shadow. For a split second, I saw it, hovering at the edge of the light, almost as if it was hiding from him. But as quickly as it appeared, it vanished, slipping back into the darkness, like a snake retreating into its den. I turned, breaking eye contact, and started walking, my pace quickening with each step. My hands were shaking, my breath shallow, my mind racing. I told myself it was just a trick of the light, just my tired mind playing games with me. But deep down, I knew that wasn't true. I could feel it, this lingering sense of dread, like something dark had latched onto me, following me as I hurried down the street. I glanced back once, just to be sure, and there he was, still standing under the streetlight, watching me. But he didn't move, didn't try to follow. He just stood there, his gaze fixed on me, unblinking, hollow. And in that moment, I knew that I'd see him again, that he wasn't finished with me. Not yet. When I finally reached my apartment, I shut the door, locking it behind me, as if that thin piece of wood could keep out whatever he was. I leaned against the door, my heart pounding, my mind replaying the encounter over and over. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw him, standing there, his empty gaze boring into me, his shadow nowhere to be seen. That night, I barely slept. Every time I closed my eyes, I'd see him, standing there in the dark, watching. waiting. I'd wake up drenched in sweat, my heart racing, my mind teetering on the edge of panic. I kept telling myself it was nothing, just a strange man, just a trick of the light. But no matter how many times I tried to convince myself, the fear wouldn't go away. In the early hours of the morning, I got up, pacing my apartment, trying to shake off the feeling that had settled in my bones. I kept glancing out the window, half expecting to see him standing there on the street, looking up at me. But there was nothing, just the quiet, empty street, bathed in the soft glow of the streetlights. I told myself I was overreacting, that it was all in my head. But deep down, I knew. I knew that something was wrong. I could feel it, like a weight pressing down on me, a darkness lurking just beyond the edge of my vision, waiting for me to let my guard down. I tried to shake it off, you know? It's funny how the mind works, how it clings to ordinary explanations to keep from unraveling completely. I kept telling myself he was just some stranger, a shadowless man who just happened to cross my path twice. It sounds ridiculous, doesn't it? I tried to believe that, though, to hold on to any reason I could find. But deep down, I knew there was nothing reasonable about him. There was something wrong. Something profoundly unnatural. Days went by, and I started to convince myself that maybe it was over, that the fear gnawing at my mind would settle into a dull memory. I went back to my routine, took the same route to work, the same route home, even though the memory of his empty gaze haunted me at every corner. And yet there was this feeling I couldn't shake, this prickling at the back of my neck, like a warning, like something was lurking just out of sight, watching, waiting. I'd catch myself glancing over my shoulder, scanning the street for any sign of him, even though I knew it was pointless. No matter how many times I looked, he was never there. But that feeling, it was constant, like a shadow that clung to me, something I couldn't escape. And then, he came back. It was late. I just stopped by the corner store to pick up a few things. Nothing special. Just milk, bread, the essentials. I was tired, my mind foggy from the long day, and as I walked, I started to feel that familiar chill creeping up my spine. You know, that instinctual sense, that primal alarm bell we all have but rarely heed? It was going off, louder and louder with every step I took. The street was empty, quiet in a way that felt unnatural, as if the world itself was holding its breath, waiting for something to happen. I tried to ignore it, to push away the creeping sense of dread, but then I saw him. There, under the streetlight, standing as still as a statue, was the man without a shadow. It was as if he'd been waiting there for me, as if he knew exactly where I'd be, like this was some sick, twisted game, and I was the unwilling participant. My heart stopped for a moment, my body frozen in place, unable to move, unable to look away. It was the same as before. He stood there, arms at his sides, his head tilted slightly forward, his gaze fixed on me. But this time, there was something different. His face, or rather, the lack of expression on his face, it seemed darker, more hollow. It was like looking into a void, a bottomless pit that threatened to swallow me whole. I wanted to turn away, to keep walking, to pretend I hadn't seen him. But I couldn't move. I was rooted to the spot, my body paralyzed by a fear so deep it felt like my very soul was recoiling. And then, something caught my eye. Just a flicker, a hint of movement at the edge of my vision. I glanced down, and there it was. His shadow. Only it wasn't his. It was faint, distorted, like a dark smudge that wavered on the pavement as if it were trying to pull away, to escape. It was barely there, like a whisper of a shadow, clinging to him against its will. My stomach twisted, a cold wave of nausea washing over me as I realized that shadow didn't want to be near him any more than I did. My mind raced, searching for an explanation, for anything that could make sense of the horror standing before me. But there was nothing. Just silence, and his gaze, that empty, hollow stare that seemed to bore into me, pinning me in place. I could feel the weight of it, pressing down on me, suffocating, like an invisible hand gripping my throat, refusing to let go. Finally, with every ounce of strength I could muster, I tore my gaze away and forced myself to take a step back. And then another, and another. My legs were shaking, my breath coming in shallow gasps, my heart pounding so hard I thought it might burst. I kept my eyes fixed on the ground, refusing to look back, refusing to give him the satisfaction of seeing my fear. But even as I walked away, I could feel his gaze on me, heavy, oppressive, like a physical weight pressing down on my shoulders. It was as if he was following me, even though he hadn't moved an inch. I kept walking, faster and faster, my footsteps echoing in the silence, my mind racing with panic. I didn't dare look back, didn't dare give him the chance to trap me in that gaze again. I told myself to keep going, to get as far away as possible, to put as much distance as I could between me and whatever he was. But with every step I took, the dread only grew, like a dark cloud that loomed over me, growing heavier and heavier until it felt like I couldn't breathe. When I finally reached my apartment, I fumbled with the keys, my hands shaking so badly I could barely get the door open. I stumbled inside, slamming the door behind me, locking it, bolting it, as if that thin piece of wood could keep him out. I leaned against the door, my breath coming in ragged gasps, my body trembling with fear. The silence of the apartment felt thick, suffocating, pressing down on me like a weight I couldn't escape. I kept expecting to hear footsteps outside, to see his shadow slip under the crack in the door, to feel his presence seeping through the walls. But there was nothing. Just me, alone in the darkness, with the memory of his hollow eyes burned into my mind. I stood there for what felt like hours, my mind replaying the encounter over and over, each memory more twisted and terrifying than the last. I tried to convince myself it was all in my head, that I was just tired, that I'd imagined the whole thing. But the fear, it was too real, too visceral, like a poison that had seeped into my veins, tainting every thought, every breath. I knew, deep down, that no amount of rationalizing would make it go away. That feeling, it was here to stay. That night, I didn't sleep. Every time I closed my eyes, I'd see him, standing under that streetlight, his shadow flickering at the edge of the darkness, his gaze fixed on me, unblinking, hollow. I lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, my mind racing, my body tense, as if bracing for something, waiting for him to appear, to find a way inside. The hours dragged on, each one more torturous than the last, until the first light of dawn crept through the window. And even then, I didn't feel safe. When morning finally came, I stumbled out of bed, my body aching, my mind foggy from exhaustion. I could barely function, my thoughts scattered, my nerves frayed. I went through the motions of my day in a daze, barely aware of anything around me, my mind consumed by the memory of him, by the horror I couldn't escape. I started taking different routes to and from work, avoiding that street, that corner, that cursed streetlight. But it didn't matter. No matter where I went, no matter how carefully I tried to avoid him, I could feel him, lurking just out of sight, watching, waiting. Every shadow, every flicker of movement, every glance over my shoulder brought that feeling back, that sickening, soul-crushing dread. And I knew that this was only the beginning. After that second encounter, I knew I couldn't keep pretending everything was normal. My mind was unraveling. I was exhausted, barely able to focus on anything, but the fear, it was like fuel, driving me to understand, to make sense of this nightmare. I couldn't sleep, couldn't eat. All I could think about was him, his hollow eyes, his shadow that wavered, trying to escape. The more I thought about it, the clearer it became. He wasn't human. No human being could move like that, look like that, exist like that. There was something ancient about him, something beyond comprehension. I began searching for anything that could explain what I'd seen. At first, I went down the usual paths: paranormal websites, ghost stories, accounts of strange figures spotted in dark places. But nothing seemed to fit. Every story I found was too ordinary. They were ghosts or spirits, things with clear motives, things you could fight against or ward off. But he was different. He felt like a piece of darkness itself, like he'd slipped through the cracks between worlds. I spent hours scrolling through forums, skimming old books on superstition, folklore, anything I could find that mentioned shadows or the absence of them. It felt obsessive, but I couldn't stop. The more I searched, the more I needed to understand, to put a name to what was haunting me. And then, one night, buried in the depths of a forgotten archive, I found something that made my blood run cold. It was an article, dated I don't even remember when. But it was old, yellowed with age, as if it had been forgotten by time itself. It told the story of a man, a shadowless man, who had been spotted in a small town hundreds of years ago. The villagers had seen him wandering the streets at night, silent and still, his shadow absent from the ground beneath him. At first, they thought he was a ghost, some lost soul who couldn't find peace. But as the sightings continued, people began to disappear. One by one, they vanished, leaving no trace, as if they had been swallowed by the night itself. The article went on to describe the fear that gripped the village. People barricaded themselves indoors, avoided going out after dark, whispering prayers to ward off the shadowless figure. But it didn't stop him. Every night, he would appear, his gaze fixed on the village, his hollow eyes watching, waiting. And then, as quickly as he had come, he vanished, leaving behind only silence and empty homes. I sat there, staring at the screen, my heart pounding. The description, it was him. It was exactly him. The stillness, the hollow eyes, the shadow that didn't belong. It was like looking into a mirror, like seeing my own nightmare laid out before me, a nightmare that had been haunting people for centuries. But that was only the beginning. The more I searched, the more stories I found. Stories that spanned across countries, across continents. A shadowless man had been seen wandering the dark alleys of London in the 1800s, appearing on the foggy streets, only to vanish just as quickly. In a remote village in Japan, people spoke of a figure with no shadow, who would appear under the moonlight, drawing closer and closer to anyone who acknowledged his presence. And in the forests of Eastern Europe, there were legends of a being who could take your shadow, who would leave you hollow, empty, a shell of who you once were. Each story was like a piece of a puzzle, each one adding to the horror, the realization that this thing, this entity, had existed long before I was ever born. It was as if he was part of the darkness itself, slipping through the centuries, following people who were alone, vulnerable, afraid. And then I found the legend that haunts me to this day. It was buried in the depths of an old folklore book, a thin, dusty volume that seemed like it hadn't been touched in years. The text was faded, difficult to read, but as I pored over it, I felt a chill settle over me, a feeling that I was looking at something forbidden, something no one was meant to see. The story was about a man who had lost his shadow as punishment for a terrible sin. According to the legend, he had been cursed to wander the earth, a shadowless shell, doomed to seek the souls of others to replace the shadow he had lost. The curse, the story said, was a punishment for betrayal, for a sin so dark that even the earth itself rejected him. He had become a part of the darkness, a void that hungered for the souls of the living. And those who encountered him, those who acknowledged his presence, were doomed to follow in his footsteps. Their shadows would fade, their souls would wither, until they, too, became a shadowless shell. I felt sick, my stomach twisting with dread as I read the words. It was as if the story was speaking directly to me, as if it was telling me what my future held. I closed the book, my hands shaking, the words echoing in my mind, a shadowless shell, a soul lost to the darkness. I tried to dismiss it, to tell myself it was just a story, just a piece of folklore that had no bearing on reality. But deep down I knew the truth. I could feel it, like a poison spreading through my veins, a darkness that had latched onto me slowly, insidiously, draining me of everything that made me, me. I started to notice changes. My reflection, once clear and solid, began to look strange, faded, almost like I was slipping out of focus, becoming less real. My shadow, too, seemed different. It flickered, wavered, as if it was struggling to stay attached, like it was being pulled into the darkness. Every night I would sit in front of the mirror, staring at my own face, watching as it seemed to fade, bit by bit. I would try to see my shadow, to make sure it was still there, still connected to me. But it was never quite right, never quite as solid as it should have been. It was like I was losing myself, piece by piece, slipping into the void. The fear became unbearable. I started to feel like I was losing my mind, like the darkness was swallowing me whole. I couldn't focus, couldn't think, couldn't sleep. I would spend hours pacing my apartment, checking every corner, every shadow, making sure he wasn't there, watching, waiting. I tried to reach out to people, to talk to someone, anyone who might understand. But every time I picked up the phone, I felt this weight, this oppressive sense that I was being watched, that he was listening, that he would find me if I spoke of him. So I kept it to myself, bottled it up, let it fester in the corners of my mind until it became all I could think about. I became a prisoner in my own mind, trapped by a fear I couldn't escape, haunted by a shadow that wasn't my own. And then one night, as I was staring into the darkness, I heard it. A faint whisper, barely more than a breath, but unmistakable. It was coming from the shadows, from the empty space that lingered just beyond the reach of the light. And in that moment, I knew he was there, waiting, watching, ready to take what little was left of me. I sat there, frozen, listening to the whispering, feeling my mind slipping further and further into the darkness. The stories, the legends, the tales of shadowless figures, they were all real. He was real. And he wasn't going to stop until I was just like him. A shadowless shell. There's a kind of madness that comes with fear, the kind that eats away at you, bit by bit, hollowing you out from the inside. It turns everything familiar into something sinister, something alien, as if the world itself has been tainted by whatever darkness has latched onto you. I tried to keep my mind together, to tell myself it was all in my head, but the fear, it had already taken root, winding its way through every corner of my mind, every thought, every breath. And it wasn't just the fear of him, of the shadowless man and what he wanted from me. No, it was the fear of what I was becoming, of the changes I could feel creeping through me. I was slipping, slowly, inexorably, becoming less real, less human. My own reflection had started to look strange, almost unfamiliar, like a stranger wearing my face. And my shadow, God, my shadow, it was like a dying thing, flickering and fading, as if it too was being pulled away. Days turned into weeks, each one blending into the next in a haze of sleepless nights and nerve-wracking dread. I stopped going out, stopped talking to people. I became a ghost in my own life, haunting the rooms of my apartment, watching the shadows shift and stretch across the walls, waiting for any sign that he was there. I couldn't escape the feeling that I was being watched, that he was always just out of sight, lurking in the dark, waiting for the right moment to... What? Take me? Replace me? I didn't know, but the fear was there, gnawing at me, relentless, unyielding. It was around that time that the sounds started. At first, it was subtle, just a faint scratching at the edge of hearing, like nails against wood, so soft I thought I might be imagining it. It would come and go, fading in and out, like a whisper carried on the wind. But as the nights went on, it got louder, more insistent, a steady, rhythmic scratching that seemed to come from everywhere. I'd hear it behind the walls, beneath the floor, echoing through the silence of the apartment, a constant reminder that I wasn't alone. I tried to ignore it, to tell myself it was just the building settling, or maybe a rat in the walls. But deep down, I knew the truth. The sound was him, reaching out, scraping against the boundaries of my reality, trying to find a way in. Then one night, I heard something new. A faint, rasping whisper, barely more than a breath, but unmistakable. It was coming from the shadows, from the corners of the room where the light didn't quite reach. I froze, every muscle in my body tense, my heart pounding in my chest. The whisper was soft, almost gentle, like a lullaby meant to lull me into a false sense of security. But the words, they were a promise of something darker, something that sent a chill through my bones. I tried to drown it out, to focus on something else, anything else, but the whisper persisted, growing louder, more insistent. It was like he was calling to me, beckoning me to step into the shadows, to let go of whatever was left of my sanity. I could feel his presence, heavy and oppressive, pressing down on me, filling the room with a darkness that seemed to seep into my very soul. That night, I didn't sleep. I sat in the corner of my room, my back pressed against the wall, my eyes fixed on the shadows that seemed to stretch and shift around me. I could feel him there, watching, waiting, his hollow eyes burning into me, a reminder of what I was becoming. I don't know how long I stayed like that, but by the time dawn finally crept through the window, I felt like a man who had seen his own death. I thought the worst was over, that maybe the daylight would chase away the shadows, that I could finally find some peace. But as the days wore on, it only got worse. The whispering became a constant companion, a soft, insidious murmur that filled the silence of my apartment. It was always there, just at the edge of hearing, a low, steady drone that seemed to burrow into my mind, unraveling whatever was left of my sanity. I tried to block it out, to distract myself, but no matter what I did, the whisper was always there, like a poison that had seeped into the very air I breathed. And then, one night, I saw him. I was lying in bed, staring at the ceiling, the whispering echoing in my mind when I felt it, a presence, standing at the foot of my bed, watching me. I didn't want to look, didn't want to see him, but I couldn't help myself. Slowly, I turned my head, my heart pounding, my breath catching in my throat. And there he was, standing in the darkness, his hollow eyes fixed on me, his form blurred and distorted, as if he was fading in and out of existence. I felt a surge of panic, a wave of terror that left me paralyzed, unable to move, unable to look away. He was closer than he had ever been, close enough that I could feel his presence, a cold, suffocating weight pressing down on me. I tried to scream, to cry out, but no sound came. I was trapped, helpless, a prisoner in my own bed, forced to endure his gaze, his silent, oppressive presence. And then slowly, he raised his hand, reaching out toward me, his fingers long and thin, almost skeletal. I could feel his touch, a cold, numbing sensation that spread through my body, freezing me from the inside out. It was like he was pulling something from me, draining me, taking whatever was left of my humanity. In that moment, I knew that I couldn't escape him, that he was a part of me now, a shadow that would follow me wherever I went. I was trapped, bound to him, a puppet in his hands, helpless to resist his pull. Somehow I managed to break free, to tear myself away from his gaze, to stumble out of bed, gasping for breath, my heart pounding in my chest. I could still feel his touch, his cold, lifeless touch, a reminder of what he had taken from me. I knew then that I couldn't stay in my apartment, that I had to get away, to find a place where the shadows couldn't reach me. But even as I left, as I stepped into the light of the new day, I could feel his presence, lingering, waiting, a darkness that had latched onto me, a shadow that would never let go. I couldn't go on like this. I knew that if I stayed in that apartment, trapped with him, with the shadows that twisted and stretched around me, I would lose myself completely. He was everywhere, in every corner, in every whisper of darkness. My mind was slipping, unraveling bit by bit, and I could feel him pulling me deeper, drawing me into a void where there was no escape. I was haunted, hollow, barely clinging to whatever shreds of sanity I had left. It was then, in the depths of my despair, that I remembered something from my research. It had been buried in the pages of an old folklore book, a passing reference to a ritual, an ancient practice used to banish spirits, to trap them in the realm of shadows where they belonged. At the time, I hadn't paid it much attention. It had seemed desperate, reckless, the kind of thing only a madman would attempt. But now, standing on the edge of madness myself, it felt like my only hope. The ritual was simple in theory, but the instructions were vague, fragmented, as if they'd been pieced together from half-forgotten whispers. I spent hours preparing, gathering the materials, reading and rereading the instructions, trying to make sense of the ancient symbols and words that seemed to shift on the page. I knew I couldn't afford to make a mistake. If this ritual failed, I would be his forever. I waited until midnight, when the world was quiet, the air thick with the weight of shadows. I turned off every light in the apartment, letting the darkness seep in, filling every corner, every crevice. I could feel his presence, lurking just beyond the reach of my sight, waiting, watching, as if he knew what I was about to do. My hands shook as I drew the symbols on the floor, a circle of protection meant to trap him, to keep him from escaping. I worked slowly, carefully, every line, every mark a lifeline, a fragile hope against the darkness that had consumed my life. When the circle was complete, I placed a mirror at its center, a small, cracked mirror I'd found at a thrift store, its surface clouded with age. According to the ritual, a mirror was meant to reflect the spirit, to show it the truth of its own emptiness, to trap it in its own hollow gaze. I didn't know if it would work. I didn't even know if I believed it would. But I had to try. With everything in place, I took a deep breath, steeling myself for what was to come. I could feel his presence, pressing down on me, filling the room with a cold, suffocating weight. It was as if the air itself had thickened, become heavy, oppressive, as if the shadows had come alive, wrapping around me like tendrils, pulling me toward the mirror, toward the void where he waited. I began to speak, my voice barely more than a whisper, reciting the ancient words I had memorized, words that felt foreign, unnatural, as if they didn't belong in this world. The sound echoed in the silence, filling the room, bouncing off the walls, carrying with it a power I couldn't explain, a force that seemed to shake the very foundation of the apartment. The shadows shifted, twisting and writhing, as if they were alive, as if they were trying to escape the words that bound them. I could feel his presence growing stronger, more desperate, a darkness that pulsed and throbbed, filling every inch of the room, pressing down on me, suffocating me. My voice trembled, but I kept going, forcing the words out, each one a lifeline, a fragile hope against the darkness that threatened to swallow me whole. And then, I saw him. He was standing in the circle, his hollow eyes fixed on me, his form blurred and distorted, as if he was struggling to hold on to reality. The sight of him sent a wave of terror through me, a cold, numbing fear that left me paralyzed, unable to move, unable to breathe. He was closer than he had ever been, close enough that I could feel his presence, a cold, lifeless weight pressing down on me, filling the air with a darkness that seemed to seep into my very soul. I forced myself to keep going, to finish the ritual, to speak the final words that would trap him, that would banish him to the realm of shadows where he belonged. But as I spoke, his gaze shifted, his hollow eyes narrowing, a flicker of something human passing over his face. It was as if he was afraid, as if he knew what was coming, as if he understood that I was about to take away the only thing he had left. But then he smiled. It was a slow, twisted smile, a mocking grin that sent a chill down my spine, that left me trembling with fear. And in that moment, I knew he wasn't going to let me win. He wasn't going to let me trap him, to take away his shadow, to banish him to the void. He was going to fight, and he was going to take me with him. The room grew darker, the shadows closing in, swirling around us like a storm, a maelstrom of darkness that filled the air with a suffocating weight. I could feel his presence, growing stronger, more powerful, a force of pure darkness, a void that threatened to swallow me whole. My hands shook, my voice faltering, as I tried to finish the ritual, to speak the final words that would banish him. But the darkness, it was too strong. It wrapped around me, pulling me toward him, pulling me into the void where he waited, a shadowless shell, a hollow man. I felt his hand on my shoulder, cold and lifeless, a touch that sent a surge of fear through me, a feeling of utter despair, as if I was staring into the depths of my own death. I tried to pull away, to break free, but his grip was like iron, a vice that held me in place, that bound me to him, to the darkness that had claimed her, him that had now claimed me. And then in the mirror, I saw it. My own reflection, distorted and twisted, a hollow shell, a shadowless figure staring back at me with empty eyes. It was me, and yet it wasn't. It was a vision of what I was becoming, of what I had become, a creature of darkness, a man without a shadow, a hollow, empty vessel. I knew in that moment that I couldn't escape him, that I was his, bound to him, a part of his world, a shadowless man, a hollow shell. The ritual had failed, the mirror had failed, and I had failed. As the darkness closed in, as the shadows wrapped around me, pulling me into the void, I felt a sense of peace, a quiet acceptance, as if I was finally free. Free from the fear, free from the darkness, free from the man without a shadow. I was nothing, and in that nothingness, I found peace. Or maybe it was just the end. I'm not sure what happened after that night. I remember the darkness, the feeling of being pulled, swallowed, consumed by something I couldn't fight. I remember the weight of his presence, the coldness of his touch, the void where my soul had once been, and then silence. When I opened my eyes, I was lying on the floor of my apartment, the first rays of dawn spilling through the window, casting long shadows across the room. I felt different, empty, hollow, like a shell that had been drained of everything that made me me. My body was cold, my skin pale, almost translucent, like a thin layer of wax stretched over something dead. I looked around, the familiar surroundings of my apartment feeling foreign, distant, as if I were seeing them for the first time, or perhaps the last. I tried to stand, but my legs were weak, my body trembling with a fatigue that went beyond anything I'd ever known. I managed to make it to my feet, clutching the wall for support, my mind reeling, struggling to piece together what had happened, to make sense of the nightmare that had become my life. But as I looked around, as I saw the shadows stretching across the floor, a new fear took hold. A fear that cut deeper than anything I had ever felt. My shadow, it was gone. There was nothing beneath me, no dark outline cast on the floor, no sign of the person I once was. I was shadowless, a hollow shell, a man without a soul, without a place in the world of the living. I reached out, my hand trembling as I pressed it against the wall, searching for any sign, any trace of my shadow. But there was nothing, just empty space, a void that stretched out around me, as if I were already part of the darkness that had claimed me. I staggered to the mirror, desperate to see, to understand, to make sense of what I had become. But as I stared into the glass, as I looked into the face staring back at me, a wave of nausea washed over me. The reflection was wrong. My eyes, once clear and bright, were now empty, hollow, like two dark voids that stared back at me with a lifeless gaze. My skin was pale, almost colorless, like a corpse left too long in the cold. And my mouth was twisted into a faint, mocking smile, a grin that didn't belong to me. It was as if I were looking at a stranger, a figure that bore my face but lacked everything that made me human. I was no longer myself. I was him. I stumbled back from the mirror, my heart pounding, my mind racing as the realization washed over me. He had taken me, consumed me, drained me of everything I was, until I was nothing more than a shadowless shell, a hollow man, bound to the darkness that had claimed him. I was his. The days that followed were a blur, a haze of confusion and fear as I tried to come to terms with what I had become. I wandered the streets, avoiding the sunlight, hiding in the shadows, feeling drawn to the darkness like a moth to a flame. I couldn't face people, couldn't bear to see the fear in their eyes, the way they would recoil, as if sensing the emptiness inside me, the darkness that had replaced my soul. And then one night, I saw him. I was standing under a streetlight, staring at the pavement, lost in thought, when I felt a presence nearby, a figure lurking just out of sight. I looked up, and there, standing across the street, was him. The man without a shadow, the hollow figure that had haunted me, tormented me, consumed me. He stood there, silent, still, his gaze fixed on me, his hollow eyes reflecting the darkness that now lived within me. But this time, he wasn't looking at me with malice or hunger. No, he was smiling. A slow, knowing smile that sent a shiver down my spine. A smile that spoke of understanding, of acceptance, of something far darker than I could comprehend. He raised a hand, a silent greeting, a gesture of acknowledgement, as if to say, "Welcome to the void, welcome to the darkness." And in that moment, I understood. I was no longer his prey, no longer a victim of his curse. I was one of them, a shadowless man, a hollow shell, bound to the darkness that had claimed me. I was part of the void, a creature of the night, a being that lurked in the shadows, waiting, watching, seeking something. I turned away, slipping into the darkness, letting it embrace me, consume me, until I was nothing more than a faint outline, a figure lost to the night. And as I walked, as I drifted through the empty streets, I felt a strange sense of peace, a quiet acceptance of my fate, a realization that I was free. Free from fear, free from pain, free from the burden of my own humanity. But even as I disappeared into the shadows, even as I became part of the void, I felt a faint, lingering whisper, a memory of the person I once was, a trace of the life I had lost. And in that whisper I heard a voice that spoke of hope, of redemption, of a light that could never be extinguished. And so, as I walk through the darkness, as I slip between worlds, I carry that whisper with me, a reminder of the life I once had, the soul I once possessed, the person I once was. And maybe one day I will find a way back, a way to reclaim what I have lost, a way to escape the void that has claimed me. But until then, I will wait, lurking in the shadows, watching, waiting, seeking something. And perhaps one day you will see me, standing under a streetlight, a shadowless figure, a hollow man, waiting to welcome you to the darkness. If you ever see a man without a shadow, if you ever feel that cold, hollow gaze watching you from the darkness, turn away. Don't look back, don't acknowledge him, don't let him draw you in, because once you see him, once you let him into your mind, he will never let you go. He will haunt you, consume you, until you are nothing more than a shadowless shell, a hollow figure lost to the void. So be careful, because the darkness is always watching, always waiting. And sometimes, it takes. If this story left you feeling unsettled, if it made you look over your shoulder just a little more, then don't forget to subscribe. There are many more tales like this, stories that lurk in the shadows, waiting for the right moment to reveal themselves. And who knows, maybe one day you'll be the one telling the story.